beyond the sea, somewhere waiting for me. My lover stands on golden sand.
Hey everyone, my name's Omar. I'm a writer. It is such a pleasure to be a part of Brick 111. I'm going to read you a very short portion from the piece I have in that issue. The piece is called Seven Swims, and this is the first part, which is titled The American Ambassador's Villa. It must have been the fall of 1988 or the winter of 1989. We were first graders at a pool party. We lost our minds. For a few hours, it was all cannonballs and sugar and squealing. And maybe somewhere on the periphery, a grown-up in the employ of the embassy was watching to make sure none of us drowned. But they were invisible to us then, or invisible in my recollection now. I remember it was a hot day. Of course it was. We lived in a desert. They were all hot days. I thought I remembered the smell of chlorine, though I'm probably superimposing it onto the memory, because it would make sense for the pool to smell like chlorine. I don't remember the face or voice of the ambassador's daughter, my first crush. I don't remember what we said to each other during those couple of minutes when we found ourselves alone under the diving board, hanging off the edge as it rubber banded under the feet of our diving classmates. The only thing I remember clearly is feeling in that moment, for the first time in my life, completely weightless. In the more than 3 decades since, I've only come close to that same lightness a handful of times. Brief, carefree bursts amid the sludge of obligation and anxiety and numbing day-to-dayness of growing old. Moments when water does what it does, pulls the punctuation out of the body's sentences, and life can be lived as it should be, in run-ons.
I'm Chris Bailey. I'm from Prince Edward Island, and I'm going to read to you a bit from my essay, A Hard Year for Birds. Texts ask if I'm alive. I give affirmative answers and step out for a quick gander. Strips of siding gone, a fistful of shingles from the house, the surrounding buildings, flashing off the east roof. The wind's diminished, but it pushes me around. I call my folks, and I'm told that where we parked the rigs during the spring and summer fisheries was water to my brother Tommy's knees. He put on shorts and old sneakers to check the boats, and he had to pump out our father's retirement boat, the Sybil Sea, as the watertight floors slope incorrectly, so water pools instead of drains. When we were at the mackerel, we pumped blood and seawater out instead of hoping it would find the scuppers. Tommy has taken over the lobster fleet, and his boat, the Grampy's boat, has a keel just low enough she stays on the side of the wharf she was tied to. Dad hadn't slept in a while. He was nervous about the boats, as everyone pretty well put theirs ashore, with my family's making up 3 of the 5 that were still in the harbour. My father tied his to the floating dock to allow more for the tidal surge. There's nowhere you're going to be safe from wind like that, he says. I'm in my car when I call, which is where I'll charge my phone and listen to the radio for the first bit of what will be, for us, an 8-day blackout. A clock radio came with the house a cousin and I rent, and while it plays cassettes, it doesn't take batteries. The rain still comes down. The wind picks at my cousin's engine bonnet, and Dad says, "Young Gallant stopped by," and he says, "Arnold, will you take me to my boat and your tractor?" I said, "Yes, bye, but I'm only going as far as I'm comfortable, and then you're on your own." I have him in the bucket, and I stop when the water starts above the front axle. I tell him, "You'll have to walk from here, or else you can stay in the bucket." And he stayed in the bucket. Dad says there were building doors blown off. A house on the road to the harbour gave its roof to the field, and another house, Danny Wilford's, that we used for a landmark while fishing, it's gone. The house above the bush is no more, he says.
I Know a Word by René Depestre. I know a word that flutters like wings. It provokes vertiginous joys. It resuscitates immortal hours. It fills the sail of my dreams. It fixes a glimmer of love in the corner of my eyes. I know a word of epic torment. It floats on the kaleidoscope of prairies, a fiddler riding on the wind, on the erosion of the hills, on the distress of cicadas, on the song of the nightingale, on the immovable and unsettled sea. I know a word of Caribbean charms. It glimmers in the bends of the rivers. in the moon at the bottom of watery pools, in the rustling of leaves, in the babbling of the cradle, in the smoky plumes of thatched huts. I know a word with that incalculable past. It tramples on the scowling of pompous lips, is enthroned in the misery of attic rooms, in the riveted slumber of straw mats, in the overflowing of cities, in the solitude of tombs. I know a word that blazes with history. It performs a reveille for fiery mornings, for gatherings in brotherly forests, for cane fields set aflame by suffering, for the unrest of thousands of oppressed, for freedom flitting on wings of death. I know a word that belongs to everyone, to shackled peasants, and to damsels in bejeweled dresses, and to pontiffs with their heads in the abyss, and to hollow-cheeked children, and to guinea fowl in the forest glades. I know a word that encloses my entire life, my hopes, my sadness, my evenings spent in tete-a-tete, my leaping about like a foal released into the savannah of the world. This word gives meaning to my life. It explains the color of my skin, the fatality of my kisses, my hatred of compromise, the slackening of my hands, ever ready to strike those who will have cheapened their charge as men. This word is my future. This word is my love. This word is my madness. Haiti.
In a 2007 interview with Eleanor Wachtel, the writer Jackie Kay said of her experience as an adoptee, quote, "For me, identity is probably particularly interesting because from the word go, you have two mothers and two fathers, and you immediately have an imaginary and a real mother. Your imaginary one being the birth mother, and the real one being the adoptive one. The opposite of what people say, I think." End quote. This has also been my experience. When I tell someone I was adopted, they usually speak of the parents who didn't raise me, the one I met for the first time at age 26, and the one I've never met, as the real ones. And they stumble over what to call the only people I've ever called without qualifications, my parents. But what Kay's observation also opens up for me is the way adoption, and in particular the narrating of one's adoption, presents a fundamental problem of chronology. When does one's story begin? I naturally tend to tell my life story from the point at which my earliest memories begin, and those are with my parents, the real ones, not the ones who were unknowable then. What I've noticed, though, is that often partway into telling such a story, a detail arises that requires explaining I was adopted, and then I must tell that story. I must start again. And what's more curious is that the listener is sometimes slightly affronted that they didn't get the real story first. Their confusion confuses me. I begin where I began. The story you may want to call real came much later to me, emerging from the murk of speculation. So I tell my story to you in the order in which it came to me. Otherwise, I begin with the haze that made me, sure, but one no less evanescent. A mist, the imaginary.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Gardinier, and I'm in Brooklyn, and I'm going to read the beginning of my essay in Brick called And It Touched Me, Poetry, Empire, and the Death of Pablo Neruda. The epigraph is from Mustafa the poet, his song called Stay Alive. All of these tribes and all of these street signs, none of them will be yours or mine, but I'll be your empire. Just stay alive, stay alive, stay alive. It's a gold afternoon in a New England sea town, and my 8th grade social studies teacher is giving me a ride home from school, listening to the news. He has a beard and works a second shift at the liquor store, near the barber shop my mother left with my brother's hair half cut when the barber said Martin Luther King got what he deserved. The town is Situate in Massachusetts, and the people whose languages made those words are nowhere and everywhere at the same time. And we, descendants of the white settlers who murdered them, are nowhere and everywhere at the same time, but on different terms. Their faces and our knowledge of them, nowhere. Their knowledges and our damaged faces, everywhere. It's junta, you bastards, my teacher yells at the radio, saying it the Spanish way. If you're going to collaborate with murderers, at least get their name right. Years pass before my mother mentions a young woman she worked with and says her father was William Brough. He worked for the CIA. And I remember that they lived off the road to the beach on Indian Trail. And more years pass before I look up William Brough and see that he ran CIA Western Hemisphere, and that one of his last assignments was to help arrange the coup against the elected socialist government in Chile 50 years ago, on September 11th, 1973. Somewhere in the middle there, I read Chilean poet Pablo Neruda's poetry, translated by Alistair Reid, with that sense I'd had all my life of being instructed in barely audible whispers by the land and by language, both of which were trying to hold me, to pass on their beauty and their long memories, their ghosts and their secrets, sending invitations I could feel the way I could feel the wind on my face or the sun on my skin. And it was at that age, Neruda wrote, poetry arrived in search of me. Poetry as in language that crosses some barrier between the instrumental and the intimate. From words that inform to words that make your skin ripple, your breath come faster, your hips move. Poetry whispering body to body in the necro state. Stay alive. There I was without a face, Neruda wrote, and it touched me. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Phoebe Wang. I'm a writer based here in Toronto, Ontario. When I moved to the city in 2008, I unexpectedly found myself crooning on my roommate's Niagara 26 sailboat, and I immediately fell in love with both the act of sailing as well as the language. So in this issue of Break 111, I have an essay on boat words, which I'll be reading an excerpt from. Boat words. A rope on a boat is never a rope, but a line, sheet, or halyard. The boat doesn't turn left or right, but to port or starboard. If you're walking to the front of any watercraft, you're going forward to the bow. When you're going to the back of a ship or boat, you're moving aft to the stern. You could draw a boat and learn to label it, but why do that when you could pick up a boat words the way a child might? Tilt your head up towards the shrouds and spreaders. Grab the mast and duck before you hit your head against the boom. Walk up on the deck, sit with your feet dangling between the stanchions, your chin on the lifelines as your shoes knock against the fiberglass hull. Pester the skipper with questions. What's this? What's that? As you get in the way in the cockpit, or until you're allowed to hold the tiller for a few moments, feeling the weight of the water streaming against the rudder. Trip, fall, jam your knee and bruise against all the hard, small parts of the boat, swearing to yourself, embarrassed at everyone's quick concern. You'll remember the cleat, block, or winch like the name of someone you've instantly disliked. Not knowing these names is as clear a sign of a landlubber as those sneakers with no tread that leave skid marks on the deck. Not knowing means you'll be corrected quickly and firmly until you do. Someone will ask you to lug a sail out from below in its heavy, awkward bag. Sails are no longer made of cotton or linen canvas, but of polyester fiber known as dacron. Spread out like wings against a southern Ontario grayish-pink sky, their plasticky edges, taut with purpose, curve against the wind like a hand around flesh. The big triangle sail along the mast is the main. It's printed with a unique number assigned by the boat builder or sailing association. The sail at the front of the boat is the foresail or head sail, either a genoa or jib depending on its cut. A genoa, affectionately called the jenny, extends beyond the mast and is used for lower winds, having a larger surface area. The jib is smaller, used for higher winds. Most boats keep one of each, or different sails for racing and cruising. There's also the spinnaker, made of thinner nylon, resembling a parachute flown on a downwind leg, giving it its nickname. Let's fly the chute, we popped the chute, and douse the chute are common commands during a regatta on endless downwind legs. The sails might power the boat, but it's the lines that work and control. Their names are shouted at the crew during times of speed and stress, which does nothing to alleviate the pressure. The lines that raise each sail are the main halyard or jib halyard. When they fly to the top of the mast, referred to as skying the halyard, it's a tragicomedy of crew shaking the mast, scrambling to the controls, or gazing helplessly upward. It's self-blame. There are topping lifts and spinnaker halyards to attach to poles. Lines need to be clipped to the bottom of the sail are known as sheets, or the main sheet, which goes to the main sheet traveler, a device that decreases or increases the boat heel. The jib sheets are attached to the clew end of the sail, threaded through blocks on either end of the boat, then wrapped around winches, big metal spools I fidget with when they aren't being used because they make satisfying clicking sounds. Other rigging lines include Cunningham, which sounds like something dirty, the boom bang, the outhaul, and narrower utility cords for attaching flags or tightening the bottom edge of a sail. Your brain might be feeling overpowered, no longer maintaining a straight course to the English language. Let out your sails. Turn away from the onslaught of words, terms, and phrases throwing you off balance. Reading isn't how I learn or how most sailors learn. Phrases like ready to come about or raise the main. You learn when they're shouted or snapped at you and you scramble for the right line on a quick tack, or when they're patiently handed out by an experienced, empathetic crew member. They're learned by their colors, plain or braided, white with woven red or blue strands, and by position, feel, and weight. They're acquired through error as you accidentally release a spinnaker halyard instead of an uphaul. They accumulate with each race, each cruise, and season, attaching themselves to verbs. Despite advances in sailing technology, materials, and instruments, sailing still relies on muscle, timing, and knowledge, as it has for millennia, on hoisting, hauling, heaving to, heading up, bearing off, letting out, easing, trimming, tacking, and jibing. There's a beautiful uncomplicatedness or complicated beauty to the pastime.
I am so honored that my work has been translated into wonderful translation by amazing Allison Markin Powell and published in such a great magazine.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Allison Markin Powell, and I am Kanako's translator, and we are delighted to read you a brief passage from the beginning of Kanako's short story, My Ass, which I translated. So we're going to alternate reading it in Japanese and English. So Kanako will go first.
Okay.
どうぞ。
私のお尻、高価な陶器のようだ。青みの直前のみずみずしい白い色。触れるとそこから溶けてしまいそうなふわりと儚げな佇まい。はにかんだようにうっすらと桃色になっている部分はかじるときっと甘く、そこにはみずみずしい張りがある。大げさなほどくるりと曲がったカーブ。丸くて少しはすっぱ、静かで、それは永遠だ。きれい。白くてつるりとしていて、キューッと盛り上がっていて。きれい。きれいな私のお尻。
It's like precious china, a fresh white, virtually blue. Touch it, and it appears almost to melt, softly giving way. The spot touched turns the slightest pink, as if bashful, and surely, if bitten into, it would taste sweet, with a lush juiciness, round, with exaggeratedly swiveled curves, and slightly vulgar. It is still and everlasting. Gorgeous. Pale and smooth, with a sudden rise. Beautiful. My lovely ass.
街で声をかけられた。怪しいものではありません。そう言って名刺を渡してきた男は何の変哲もない普通の男だった。グレーのシンプルなスーツ、エビ茶色のネクタイ、普通の背丈に普通の顔。その日私は30歳の誕生日を迎えたところだったが、迷子になった幼い頃、両親以外の大人に声をかけられた時のような気持ちになった。男に対して恐怖を感じるより、ただただぼんやりと心もとなかった。あなたご自身の中で少し遠くに置いておきたいものはないですか？男はそう言った。私にはその言葉の意味がわからなかった。違う言い方をしてみましょう。少し距離を置いて見守っておきたいものです。男の物言いは優しかったが、男が笑っているのか、それとも怪しげな顔をしているのかは、なぜかわからなかった。単刀直入に申し上げましょう。あなたのお尻ですよ。それを聞いた時点で逃げてもよかった。大声を出してもよかった。でも、私はそうしなかった。どころかその男に、子供の頃経験したような無責任な興味を持った。はい。やはり迷子だ。たくさんの見知らぬ人、知らない風景、そこに迷い込み、両親にはもう永遠に会えないだろうと思っている幼い絶望の中で、自分を異世界に連れて行ってくれる魔術師に会ったような気分だった。両親とはぐれた時点で自分は一度死んでいる。この先何が起こっても恐れる理由さえないと投げやりになった子供のふてぶてしさがその時の私にはあった。はっきり。
A man approached me on the street. Don't get the wrong idea. He said this as he handed me his business card. He was a nondescript, perfectly ordinary fellow. He wore a simple gray suit with a maroon tie. Average height, average looks. Although at the time I was about to turn 30, I felt like a lost child approached by an unfamiliar grown-up, not one of my parents. It wasn't so much that I was frightened by the man. I felt a vague uneasiness. Is there anything about yourself that you might like to, perhaps, leave behind? The man asked. I didn't understand what he meant. Let me put it another way. Is there something you might like to get some distance from, to see from afar? He spoke gently, but for whatever reason, I couldn't tell whether he was smiling or if there was something suspicious about his expression. Let me get right to the point. I'm referring to your bottom. I might have run away when he said that. I might have screamed, but I didn't do either of those things. Quite the contrary, I felt irresponsibly intrigued by the man. Very much that same feeling I had had when I was young. Yes, I was that lost child all over again. So many unfamiliar faces in unknown places. As I wandered toward them, despite the childlike despair I felt at the thought of never seeing my parents again, it was as though I had encountered a sorcerer who was leading me into another world. I died a little when I strayed from my family. I knew at that moment that whatever happened now, there was no reason to be afraid, and that I was that brazen, apathetic child, without a doubt.
私はパーツモデルをしている。最も有名なパーツモデルは手ではないだろうか。ハンドクリームの CM や料理の広告、ネイルアートのポスターなどに見られる血管の筋の見えない細くて尖っていて驚くほど綺麗な手は彼女ら手のモデルのものである。アイシャドウの広告に使われる目専門のモデルもいるし、かかとの角質を取るクリームの CM に使われる足専門のモデル、耳栓のパッケージに使われる耳専門のモデルもいる。私はパンティストッキングや下着の CM やエステティックサロンの広告などのお尻専門のモデルだ。初めてこの世界に入ったのは20歳を過ぎた頃だった。私は当時、チェーン店のコーヒースタンドでアルバイトをしていた。店の制服は白いシャツにピタリとした茶色いタイトスカートだった。 私は器量が良くなかったが、この制服を着ている時だけは男性の視線を感じた。それも顔にではなく背後にだ。自分のお尻の形がきれいなことに気づいたのはその頃だった。他のアルバイトの女の子のお尻を見ても、ペタッとうつむいているものやどこかの大陸のように広がったもの、とにかくスカートを盛り上げるようにキュッと上がった私のお尻とは程遠かった。そして道行く人を見ている限り、どうやら日本人女性のほとんどが私のようなお尻を持っていないこと、つまり私のお尻が特別であることが分かった。
I worked as a parts model. The best known parts models are probably hand models. You see them in advertisements for hand cream or cooking commercials or posters featuring nail art and the like. Stunningly beautiful hands without a single visible vein and with slender tapered fingers. Theirs are the epitome of hands. There are eye models whose eyes are used in ads for eyeshadow, foot models whose heels can be seen in commercials for products that removed calluses, even ear models whose ears appear on packages of earplugs. I am a butt model. My butt can be seen in commercials for pantyhose and underwear or in advertisements for beauty treatment clinics. I first got into this business shortly after I turned 20. Back then, I had a part-time job at a chain store coffee stand. The store uniform was a white shirt with a close-fitting brown pencil skirt. I'm not attractive. The only time I was ever aware of men looking at me was when I wore this uniform. Even then, they weren't looking at my face. They were looking at my rear. Around this time, I became aware of the shapely beauty of my own posterior, seeing the bottoms of the other girls who worked there, either slack and pancake flat or expansive like some landmass. For what it's worth, theirs looked vastly different from mine, packed as it was into my skirt with the fabric stretched tight. And as far as I could tell from looking at people out in the street, most Japanese women did not have an ass like mine. That is to say, I came to realize that it was quite special.
お風呂に入るとき、自分の背面を鏡に映して、私はたびたびうっとりした。形がきれいなのはもちろんだが、吸い付くような手触りや初々しい白桃のような白い色も他の女の子は持っていないだろうと思った。私は宝物を慈しむようにして自分のお尻を洗った。そして夜はお尻が苦しい思いをしないで済むようにうつ伏せで眠った。お尻は私の寝息に合わせ健やかに上下した。スー、スーというその甘やかな音を聞くのが私は好きだった。男性店員や客からの熱烈な視線は恥ずかしがったが、振り返って急に声をかけた時の彼らの動揺は面白かった。顔を真っ赤にしてしどろもどろになっている彼らを見ていると、自分がとても可愛い人気者の女の子になれたような気がした。でもそれもほんの一瞬だった。視線を上げた先に私の顔があると、彼らはすぐに落ち着きを取り戻し、そこに誰もいないかのような表情に戻った。彼らが興味を持つのはただ一つ、私のお尻だけだった。私はよく自分のお尻が自分の顔だったらと考えた。きっとたくさんの男性から愛され、慈しまれただろう。こんな可愛い女性に会ったことがないと言われていただろう。私はおでこにお尻と書いた私がたくさんの人に追いかけられる夢をたびたび見た。そして目が覚めた後は静かに泣いた。私の顔は私の顔で、私のお尻はお尻だった。
When bathing, I was often enchanted by the sight of my own backside reflected in the mirror. There was its obvious shapeliness, but moreover, other girls' bottoms didn't have the same tautness or the ripeness of a fresh white peach. I washed my bottom as if it were a prized possession. Then, each night I would sleep on my stomach so as to avoid causing my ass any discomfort. It rose and fell soundly, keeping time with my breath as I slept. I enjoyed hearing the sweet and gentle noises it made. I felt embarrassed by the intent gazes of the male employees and customers at the coffee stand, but I did find it amusing to fluster them by turning around suddenly and calling them out. Seeing their faces go bright red in agitation made me feel pretty, like I had become one of the popular girls. But even that only lasted for a fleeting moment. Once they raised their gaze and saw my face, The men would regain their composure, their expressions changing back as if they hadn't noticed anyone there. The only thing that held their interest was my ass. I often wondered, what if my ass were my face? Surely I'd have lots of male admirers. The men would love me. I've never seen such a pretty girl, they'd tell me. I had a recurring dream in which the word ass was printed on my forehead, and I was being chased by a mob. I would wake up and sob quietly. My ass was my ass, and my face was my face.
Somewhere beyond the sea, somewhere waiting for me, my lover stands on golden sands and watches the ships